What's up, party people? This is the third chapter of Sean Matgamna's Introduction to the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism. This chapter is titled Neo-Trotskyist and Stalinist Expansion. Section 1 is titled Provisional Formula Erected into World Historic Interpretation. And it starts with a quote from Leon Trotsky in his book, The Third International After Lenin. Quote, "The leadership oriented itself without any synthesized understanding of our epoch and its inner tendencies, only by groping Stalin and by supplementing the fragmentary conclusions thus obtained with scholastic schema renovated for each occasion, Bukharin. The political line as a whole, therefore, represents a chain of zigzags. The ideological line is a kaleidoscope of schemas tending to push to absurdity every segment of the Stalinist zigzags. The Sixth Congress would act correctly if it decided to elect a special commission in order to compile all the theories created by Bukharin and intended by Bukharin to serve as a basis, say, for all the stages of the Anglo-Russian Committee. These theories would have to be compiled chronologically and arranged systematically so as to draw a fever chart of the ideas contained in them. It would be a most instructive strategic diagram. The same also holds for the Chinese Revolution, the economic developments of the USSR, and all other less important questions. Blind empiricism multiplied by scholasticism," end quote. Leon Trotsky, The Third International After Lenin. Now to the text. Trotsky rejected the idea that the Russian system at the end of the 1930s was even minimally solid and coherent. The Russian system lacked, quote, crystallized class relations, end quote, Trotsky. Only because of this did Trotsky reject the idea that the bureaucracy was a ruling class. The bureaucracy was, Trotsky thought, a parasitic growth on the continuously degenerating forms of collectivized economy rooted in the 1917 revolution. By the end, the time span Trotsky projected was very short. Quote, "Might we not place ourselves in a ludicrous position if we affixed the Bonapartist oligarchy, the nomenclature of a new ruling class, just a few years or even a few months prior to its inglorious downfall," end quote. He wrote in The USSR in War, which is on this channel. Trotsky's refusal to conclude that the ruling bureaucracy was a ruling class was fundamentally and explicitly tied to and dependent on that time scale. In that sense only, and for that reason only, did Trotsky deny that the bureaucracy was a ruling class. Far from his refusal to call it a ruling class expressing softness towards the bureaucracy, Trotsky, as we saw, compared it unfavorably with Nazism. The policy of, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote, was part of this complex of ideas expressing the concept of a, quote, interregnum economy, end quote. Degenerating from the revolution, but not yet overthrown by bourgeois forces, it retained the potential of regeneration by way of a new working class, quote, political revolution, end quote. It was not, in Trotsky's view, a degenerated workers' state in stable equilibrium, but continually degenerating. Else, he had said it only tentatively, it was a new form of class society whose features were its own norm, not a degeneration of something else. Yet, though this gave unmistakable signs of direction, it left the theoretical question at Trotsky's death in a state of chaos and flux. Nothing could be more unsatisfactory than a political legacy which argued passionately for political conclusions that flowed from the bureaucratically statized economy when seen in one framework, degenerated worker state, while at the same time its proponents accepted that an alternative framework, new ruling class, from which other conclusions would follow, might prove to be better and would, moreover, have to be adopted if the phenomenon lasted much longer in its present form. Yet that is how things stood when Stalin's assassin, Mercador, struck Trotsky down. Mercador, according to Max Shachtman, was met by Che Guevara in Cuba after Mercador's prison sentence in Mexico, which I believe is like 18 years or something like that. So that would have been, if Leon Trotsky was assassinated in 1940, that would have been, I don't know, in the early 1960s, late 1950s. I'm not sure. when he went to Cuba, at least. The USSR did last, coming out of the World War intact and an occupation of vast tracts of Eastern and Central Europe. However, the conclusions drawn then by Trotsky's most loyal, quote, disciples, end quote, his partisans of 1939 to 40, were not those that Trotsky indicated for such an eventuality, but their very opposite, views akin to those Trotsky had long ago been forced to jettison. What was to be, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyism by the mid-1950s had been called Brandlerism and Bauerism in Trotsky's lifetime. On the class nature of the Soviet Union, the theoretical identity of the Trotskyists had not been disentangled from that of the Stalinists, who also, quote, defended the Soviet Union, end quote. Political conditions existed for the international Trotskyist movement after Trotsky's subtleties died with him, to repeat the political collapse of the left opposition in 1928 to 30. Continuing to criticize, they nevertheless accepted as, quote, progressive, end quote, despite everything, the expansion of Stalinism. They translated Trotsky's defense of the Soviet Union into partisanship for the USSR empire. This pattern would last as long as the USSR did, and longer. The Neo-Trotskyist solution to the problem of the post-war Russian Empire, restricting the world empire to mean monopoly capitalist empire, obfuscated but could not resolve the problem. Without being defined, it would be one of the issues that split the forces of orthodox Neo-Trotskyism in 1953, at the time of the East German workers' uprising. Trotsky's failure to understand Stalinism fully are not difficult to understand. Faced with 19th century industrial capitalism, for generations the critics and rebels against the bourgeois system had not fully understood it. Some tended to understand capitalism and the exploitation of the working class as a mere extension of landlordism and age-old land-based robbery. Myths about exploitation originating in the Norman conquest did widespread service as general explanations well into the Chartist times. It is no cause for wonder that in the first years of the new phenomenon of Stalinism, there was not instant clarity. Columbus tried to sail to the Indies and found an unexpected, unknown continent rising out of the sea before him. Columbus died without ever understanding or accepting that it was not the Indies, but a, quote, new world, end quote, that Columbus had found. So with Trotsky and the unexpected social system that was Stalinism. Trotsky, too, had a false map of history. Though Trotsky understood so much about Stalinism, Trotsky postponed defining Stalinism as the distinct socioeconomic formation Stalinism was. Much of the difficulty was to cease seeing Stalinism in terms of either capitalism or socialism, and to examine Stalinism as something new, having a, quote, finished, end quote, settled character. It was strange, new, and evolving. At the end of Trotsky's life, Trotsky would talk of the USSR as a counter-revolutionary workers' state, displaying, quote, elements, end quote, of imperialism. But Trotsky still saw it in terms of other formations, capitalism, socialism, and only tentatively, and as if through a shifting mist, as what it really was, a socioeconomic formation distinct both from capitalism and socialism, distinct from capitalism, although the bureaucracy was not a mere parasitic growth on a backward workers' state, but a formed exploitative class, which, as Trotsky put it towards the end, seized and disposed of all the social surplus product, and distinct from working-class socialism, although it was anti-capitalist, and, in its own bureaucratic way, quote, collectivist, end quote, and a, quote, planned, end quote, economy. New section, quote, in defense of Marxism, end quote. I'm assuming this section is going to be about the book In Defense of Marxism that was compiled after Trotsky's death, which gives a one-sided display solely from Trotsky of the debates with the minority group within the Socialist Workers' Party. And by minority, I mean a large minority, which took 40% of the membership of the Socialist Workers' Party when it disembarked to set up the Workers' Party under the leadership of Max Shachtman. So In Defense of Marxism, this book, In Defense of Marxism was published in the 1940s. This book, which actually features some of the, a lot, and so the same can be said of Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, edited by Haberkern and Lippau. Both these books were published in the 90s, and so for 50 years, unless you were a true scholar of the tradition and you followed the work of, say, people like maybe like Hal Draper or Julius Jacobson or other people that like continued the third camp tradition, your only access, I think, to my understanding, if you're introduced to socialism or Trotskyism, your only source of information on these debates and conflicts within international Trotskyism and American Trotskyism in particular would have been through In Defense of Marxism. So this book, I think, is actually a very important historical corrective in terms of publishing. In September and October 1939, Trotsky, as we have noted, tentatively accepted the USSR as it was could be seen in a radically different theoretical framework, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. Trotsky said it was too early actually to reach such a conclusion, but irrevocably he had accepted it in principle. Then close on this radical theoretical break with the past, hypothetical, conditional as it was, but a fundamental departure nonetheless. Trotsky engaged in a bitter political struggle against Burnham and Shachtman. His polemics then for, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote, against Shachtman, Martin Aber, and James Burnham, and about half of his American comrades, had the catastrophic effect after his death of half burying what was new in his final position and obscuring the direction of his thought. His, quote, orthodox, end quote, disciples would erect and freeze as, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, ideas and attitudes with which Trotsky was probably breaking, and add for good measure ideas he see below had spent his last 17 years fighting. The drama of the 1939-40 faction fight and split would be both the nativity and the Easter resurrection story for post-Trotsky Trotskyism. Its literature by Canon N. Trotsky kept, quote, authoritative, end quote, by non-publication of Trotsky's other vehemently anti-Stalinist articles on the USSR of the same time, would educate and miseducate generations and be the cultural medium of a tendency whose perspectives of workers' revolution were elaborations, not without criticism to be sure, and for the Soviet Union calls for political revolution on hopes for the success of Stalinism. Trotsky's polemics from the faction fight were collected in a book, In Defense of Marxism, first published in December 1942. Quote, the USSR in war, end quote, wherein for the first time he accepted the possibility that the USSR was as it was, without transformation, might have to be reconceptualized. Is the first major item in the 1942 collection. It is followed by a large collection of polemics against those who questioned unconditional defense of the USSR when Stalin was Hitler's partner in carving up Poland and then invaded bourgeois democratic Finland, and against those who said or implied that the USSR was already to be defined as a bureaucratic collectivist or state capitalist state. In Defense of Marxism, the heavy emphasis is on the idea that the Soviet Union is not, or not yet, to be given up. This book, and a companion volume by James P. Cannon from the Factional Struggle, came to embody, quote, orthodox Trotskyism, end quote. Around In Defense of Marxism was built the alleged continuity with Trotsky's movement of the politically reconstructed and radically changed post-war, quote, Trotskyism, end quote. From 1942 to 1969 to 70, when the first, quote, scrapbook, end quote, versions of Trotsky's collected writings from the 1930s began to appear, working backwards from 1940, In Defense of Marxism was the main account of Trotsky's views on the Soviet Union known to English-language readers, apart from the Revolution Betrayed, written before the Moscow trials. If you take the articles on Stalinism from Trotsky's last 18 months and read them in sequence, putting the pieces in Defense of Marxism in their proper place in the series, you get a very different picture of what Trotsky was saying and where Trotsky was going, and a radically different balance. You could, carefully picking through the USSR in war, get an idea of what Trotsky was saying, or half saying, quote, for now, end quote, and where he might be going, but the countering, numbing, neutralizing effect of the rest of the unbalanced collection, with its harsh denunciation of the, quote, petty bourgeois opposition, end quote, of Shachtman and the others, weighed massively and for most people decisively against doing that. By contrast, had the USSR in war been published in its proper place in the sequence, it would have been hard not to get Trotsky's drift, and hard to see his rather wild polemical sallies as the last word, and harder to take the road the official Trotskyists did take. But the selection in defense of Marxism was itself the result of decisions about which road to take. What was put and kept in circulation embodied political selection and political alignment. From the death of Trotsky onward, his works were picked over and used instead of living theory, to garnish empirical political responses and never again coherent policies arrived at by means of adaptation to other forces. In Defense of Marxism appeared in December 1942 as the Socialist Workers' Party entered into a white heat of Soviet patriotism, which was very popular in all the lands allied with Stalin, including the USA. In most people's minds, it would have merged with the local patriotism, which the Socialist Workers' Party, of course, rejected and repudiated. The publication of In Defense of Marxism and its slant reflected that wartime pro-Sovietism and perpetuated it. The period of 1942 was a time when the Militant, the Neo-Trotskyists newspaper, the Socialist Workers' Party newspaper, was inclined to deny or half deny that the Soviet-Nazi alliance had ever occurred, and when it was admitted, they argued that such an alliance was unnatural anyway, the place of the Soviet Union being, it was implied, naturally with the good guys. The book, with its extremely violent and unqualified condemnation of the, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, opposition, appeared at a time when, 1 year after the USA's entry into World War II, that condemnation had already been proven in life to be nonsensical at every level. Shachtman's, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, opposition had been accused of recoiling against the Hitler-Stalin pact because they were capitulating to American bourgeois democracy. In 1942, that opposition, organized in the Workers' Party, stood before the American working class as defenders of neither the newly popular Soviet Union nor of the USA. The Shachtmanites preached stark opposition to the USA's war. Their young people had systematically gone into industry where they would consistently have a higher profile than the Socialist Workers' Party, whose trade unionists were told to, quote, preserve the cadre, end quote, in industry during the war by keeping their heads down. Faction fights generate exaggeration, suspicion, wild extrapolation. Events had shown by December 1942 what had been in the old polemics. To publish these comments from the late 1939 and early 1940, comments which flew in the face of the subsequent developments, was an act of willful and heedless factional libel. It is impossible to think that Trotsky would have approved. And yet the story is still worse. If you read the reprinted records of the 1939-40 fight, you are led to assume that the Socialist Workers' Party in the war was always ardently for defense of the Soviet Union. The Militant and the Socialist Workers' Party were for defense of the Soviet Union, but they became the passionate upfront public defenders of the USSR only after the tide of the war had turned in Stalin's favor at Stalingrad in 1942. They were part of what Communist partiers knew as the, quote, Stalingrad draft, end quote. Before that, for a whole year, defense of the Soviet Union had had low priority in the pages of the paper. Such is the origin of the compilation that shaped post-Trotsky Trotskyism for over 30 years, and still does so now that Trotsky's other writings of the time are in print. It was both symptomatic and central to the shaping of, quote, orthodox, end quote, Neo-Trotskyism. The element of accommodation to Stalinism's success is central and massive. Section 3. Freezing, quote, Trotsky, end quote, into dogma. In 1929, many members and leaders of the left opposition in the USSR surrendered to Stalin because, in erecting the totalitarian power of the new bureaucratic class and destroying what was left of the labor movement, he also kicked the feeble NEP bourgeoisie into its grave. Trotsky did not. Trotsky had an independent axis, which his partially false conceptions of Stalinism twisted but did not uproot. So too at Trotsky's end. The Neo-Trotskyists had no such axis, nor had they Trotsky's political and theoretical culture. They made of Trotsky's, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of the, quote, workers' state, end quote, a dogma which had less and less grip on the reality of Stalinism, and combined that blind incomprehension on the level of theory with opportunist adaptations. They did remain critics of Stalinism and advocates of working-class democracy, while supporting Stalinism, quote, against capitalism, end quote. This combination of eyeless dogmatism and sometimes exuberant opportunist adaptation to successful and, quote, victorious, end quote, Stalinism produced very bizarre results within 2 years of Trotsky's death and would continue to do so for almost half a century. By erecting Trotsky's conclusions of a particular time against his method, the official Trotskyists both expressed their own unwillingness to think and sealed off the propensity to think of newcomers for generations. Mummery displaced Marxism as a living thing. This is precisely what Natalia Sadova-Trotsky will say when she leaves the Fourth International, moving towards a more state capitalist theory, which people say is due to the influence of Grandizo Muniz. Theoretical poverty, together with a religiosity rooted in fear to try to think along Trotsky's lines and face the real world, fear to look uncongenial reality in the eye, fear of, quote, disillusionment, end quote, fear of not being, quote, objective, end quote, fear of not being with the real, quote, revolutions of our times, end quote, led to a hardening of the heart and of the mind. This produced a view of the world in the early 40s, and then in the early 50s akin to millenarian religion. It is not surprising to find the long-time British adherents of this sort of Neo-Trotskyism, the Heelyites, albeit in the 1970s after they had gone seriously mad, engaging in public ceremonies structured around Trotsky's death mask. Is this like describing a real... Sorry, this maybe sounds stupid. This is like describing a real thing. Like, were they always adhering to, like, is this like a, the thing I'm asking is like, after they had gone seriously mad, does that mean that this religion was not just like a formal, like a kind of, is this being a metaphor, or is this being, serious? I don't know. Read that sentence though. It's not surprising to find the long-time British adherents of this sort of Neo-Trotskyism, the Heelyites, albeit in the 1970s, after they had gone seriously mad, engaging in public ceremonies structured around Trotsky's death mask. Trotsky's tentative and questioning position of an alternative to the workers' state framework unavoidably also implied a questioning, pro tem attitude to the old position. But the old position was frozen by his ardent disciples. They cut away Trotsky's last qualifications and questionings and hypothetical conclusions, and chose in due time to interpret the survival and expansion of Stalinism as proof that nothing in the USSR's, quote, working class character, end quote, had changed or required consideration. Trotsky had in anticipation said plainly that opposite conclusions would be indicated if the Stalinist system survived and had to be considered as stabilized. Trotsky had at the end set empirical and temporal tests for deciding that Stalinism was a new form of class society. Those who insisted they were the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists ignored and implicitly rejected these tests. Events after Trotsky's death, when the Soviet Union survived, conquered great territories, became the second power in the world, and was replicated in foreign countries, were entirely outside what was even conceivable to Trotsky. But they pointed all the more forcefully to the conclusions Trotsky had indicated in the event that the USSR proved more stable than he had thought. Having in the course of the faction struggle, which continued as rivalry between the two parties that resulted from it, the Workers' Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, declared the alternative bureaucratic collectivist framework which Trotsky had tentatively posed in September 1939 as the greatest heresy and, quote, revision, end quote, of the, quote, program of the Fourth International, end quote. The Neo-Trotskyists had boxed themselves off from resuming Trotsky's train of thought when time and experience of the USSR's survival in war made it imperative. Whereas Trotsky had in anticipation said plainly that new conclusions would be indicated if the Stalinist system survived, his disciples, ignoring Trotsky's thought while using his words, still held that so long as nationalized property remained and was being spread, nothing had changed or required reconsideration. Trotsky had broken with that position in September-October 1939. They were taken in tow by the Stalinist empire of countries which they soon discovered were, quote, in transition to socialism, end quote. Section 4, Stalinist society in transition to socialism, question mark. Faced with the survival and expansion of Stalinism, Trotsky's real and evolving idea of Stalinism was destroyed amongst his followers, even while they held to the letter of his pre-1939 reasoning. The new bureaucratic formations in China, etc., could not be understood, as Trotsky had said. The USSR bureaucracy was to be in conflict and contradiction with the collectivist property they created. Bureaucratically collectivized property could not now be identified even obliquely with a form of working class property. James Connolly's mordant joke, quote, "If state ownership is socialism, then the jailer and the hangman are socialist functionaries," end quote, had taken on a grim new meaning in the face of Stalinism. The old basic notion of socialism, that political power was decisive, logically came into its own, even if the confusions engendered by Trotsky's attempts to account for the USSR had been justified. The Neo-Trotskyists, who chose instead to hold to the letter of Trotsky's ideas, did so because of the seeming resemblance of Stalinist society to socialist forms, nationalized property and the elimination both of the capitalist mode of economic activity and of the bourgeoisie which personified it. And because attempts to analyze the world afresh threatened to collapse what they understood as the whole Marxist system. Within the verbiage of Trotsky, which they turned into a sacerdotal language, they radically altered Trotsky's ideas. In substance, despite the forms of property, the USSR for Trotsky was not post-capitalist in the sense of being ahead of world capitalism. It could not be. The most basic ideas of Marxism on socialism's necessary relationship to capitalism in history ruled it out. With its expansion, Stalinism had, said Trotsky's epigons, miraculously changed the direction of its social and class evolution, as Trotsky had seen them, where the USSR had inexorably been moving towards a convulsive restoration of capitalism. Stalinism in the USSR and its clones across an additional 6 of the world were now post-capitalist societies, quote, in transition to socialism, end quote, where socialism in one country had been in Marxist terms, as understood by the Communist International and the Trotskyist movement of Trotsky's time, a piece of illiteracy expressing the world outlook of the bureaucracy, and in USSR life a gruesome mockery of socialism. A modified version of it became the operational idea of the Neo-Trotskyists. It was, wrote Ernest Mandel being probably like one of the prime representatives of Orthodox Trotskyism, very important figure in the history of Trotskyism, if you didn't know already. And he wrote the introductions in the first 3 volumes of the Penguin edition of Marx's Capital. Excuse me. It was, wrote Ernest Mandel, for example, no longer one country, but a cluster of countries. Most of these countries were backward, though not all, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, but they were evolving towards socialism by way of what earlier Marxists would have dismissed as utopian colony building on a giant scale. On the periphery of world capitalism, socialism was, quote, for now, end quote, evolving not out of advanced capitalism and its spawn and replica, but as its competitor, moving from the periphery to the center. Formal lip service, on ceremonial occasions and in ceremonial documents, to the idea that the world revolution would only be completed when capitalism was overthrown in the advanced countries, could not make sense of this in terms of the Marxism of Marx, Lenin, and Trotsky. That idea was for the future, more or less remote, and meanwhile the USSR, etc., were, quote, societies in transition to socialism, end quote, side by side with capitalism. The, quote, actually existing revolution, end quote, was a matter of, quote, one too many socialisms in one country, end quote. On an international scale, it bore more than a passing resemblance to the vision of Mikhail Bakunin in the First International, and after about the effective movement for revolution coming from the social fringes and social depths, not from the proletariat of advanced capitalism, on the basis of the best achievements of that capitalism, but from the, quote, wretched of the earth, end quote, on the edges of capitalism. Yeah, that's like one of the things you'll hear a lot is that like a lot of like tankies and third worldists and all kinds of muck will have high praise for Bakunin's voluntarism and Bakunin's veneration, to which, and the degree of which I'm not sure of. I'm not a Bakunin scholar. I haven't read much Bakunin myself, and I haven't read any kind of a secondary literature on him by people who aren't. I just really haven't read any secondary literature on Bakunin. But the two things that like Tanky's like is his like veneration of voluntarism and his kind of like veneration of like the lumpen proletariat and like the outsider and shit like that. And and then the problem with that is like it's not that there's people in the lumpen proletariat cannot participate in social upheaval or anything like that. I don't think that's the case. But for me, this is just me talking about myself personally. Having a self-managed society, an autonomous society, entails a degree of responsibility and social control, right? There's what's the word? Creating social. I feel like there's this idea is like the revolutionary agent who is like those who are like most pissed about like injustice or something like that will be like the revolutionary vanguard based on purely like negative subjective experiences of capitalism. But I think that like the idea that the working class would be the revolutionary agent that ushers in the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think part of the reason, like, I don't think Marx or anybody like that had the idea that like peasant revolts don't happen. There's a long history of peasant revolts against established powers. I don't think that their idea wasn't that like, I mean, this is just to my understanding, like the idea wasn't that like peasants or the lumpen proletariat couldn't be like extremely dissatisfied with capitalism and take on like brave actions against the status quo or anything like that. But I think that there's subjective and objective reasons why that agent would be the working class and not people like that, not classes or social stratum like that. And I think one of them is the idea that, for one, the peasantry, or more likely than not, obviously, there's complications in this, and Rosa Luxemburg saw this and why she kind of disagreed with land to the peasantry when that was decreed by the Bolsheviks, is that what's going to happen is that they're going to divide their land into fucking separate peasant plots, and I believe that's what happened in France in the wake of the French Revolution. Though I'm not an expert on that, when the estates fell apart, they didn't become like capitalist estates. They became like petty, more or less self-sufficient peasant land. And a lot of people think that capitalism didn't really get going in France until the late 19th century. Anywho, his idea is that the working class would be appropriating a material substratum that was already highly concentrated and could not be divided into separate like parcelized parts, right? You couldn't divide like Google into like different sections of Google and say this is my section of Google and this is my section, and like you couldn't really do that. You could only appropriate that something like that collectively, right? So I think that's one reason why the working class was the revolutionary subject, so to speak. And also that the revolutionary working class would be organized, right? Like it wouldn't just be like it would have a vision of what it wanted and self-consciously plan out and how it was going to appropriate the economic assets of society, right? It had a vision of what it was doing. It wasn't kind of like some automatic, like, subconscious revolt, And so that's why people, and I guess that's a critique of like not only like fucking like third worldist people, but a lot of anarchists who think that like rage and bravery and a willingness to be violent are something akin to substitutes for a grand historical vision of how civilization would have to change in order to be an emancipated civilization. Yeah. But, sorry, I'm just talking to myself. In this way, Trotsky's ideas proclaimed as, quote, official and, quote, orthodox Trotskyism were turned on their head, turned inside out and turned upside down. Socialism in one country, or, quote, socialism in a number of backward countries, end quote, was proclaimed to be the permanent revolution. The view that became dominant as Neo-Trotskyiism was already present in Trotsky's time. It existed in the communist movement with the, quote, right communists, end quote, Brandler, Lovestone, etc., but also among social democrats. Old Fabian, George Bernard Shaw, for example, regarded both Stalinism and fascism as progressive agents of the collective spirit immanent in the 20th century capitalist society. Their ideas were brought into the fringes of the Trotskyist movement by the Italian Bruno Rizzi, who is remembered because Trotsky polemicized with Rizzi in 1939-40. Like Shaw, who must have influenced him, Rizzi regarded the Stalinist system, which he defined as a new form of class society, as progressive. And like the right communists and Isaac Deutscher, who had popularized their views mixed with elements of Trotskyism, he thought this system could grow organically and smoothly into socialism without revolution. On Isaac Deutscher, check out the piece Isaac Deutscher, An Anatomy of an Apologist on this channel by Julius Jacobson, who is a member of the Third Camp, Trotskyism in the United States, founding editor of New Politics. Also check out, it hasn't been posted up yet, but check out, I just recorded a piece by Peter Bailhartz from his book Trotsky, Trotskyism, and the Transition to Socialism, or whatever it's called, and that chapter is about Isaac Deutscher. And it says a similar thing to what Matgamna is saying here now. Back to the text. This idea of Stalinism as viable and progressive came to be adopted by the so-called official Trotskyists, those who, after Trotsky's death, made a palimpsest of his words and text into which they interpolated alien ideas. The degenerated and deformed worker state theories were Bruno Rizzi's progressive, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, quote, Trotskyized, end quote, exclamation point. It is possible to argue that, faced with the reshaping of the world in and after World War II, Trotsky would have abandoned the path of thought which he sketched out in the USSR in War, again and once more, and in his last articles, and agreed with his, quote, orthodox, end quote, disciples. It is certain on the literary evidence that the, quote, disciples, end quote, in elaborating what became official post-Trotsky Trotskyism, did not follow Trotsky's method and did not heed what he wrote. They erected part of Trotsky's tentative conclusions above reality, and for 30 years suppressed much of what he wrote alongside in defense of Marxism. Trotsky was flatly at variance with the positions that were, for decades after his death, falsely presented as his quote, last word, end quote. The alleged continuity of, quote, orthodox, end quote, Neo-Trotskyism with Trotsky was not in fact continuity, but regression to the Trotskyism of before 1933. In a world where Stalinism had plainly moved on very far from the reality of the 1920s, which still shaped Trotsky's views up to 1933, its angry criticism of Stalinism were vitiated by its commitment to, quote, unconditional defense, end quote, of the Stalinist state, and later the Stalinist empire, against capitalist forces. Trotsky was receptive to events and their implications. The Neo-Trotskyist movement used, quote, Trotsky's position, end quote, in lieu of thought and real analysis. Neo-Trotskyist analysis was cut and tailed and topped and pruned to fit into a static framework made by taking a snapshot of one moment, one side of Trotsky's 1939-40 writings, out of what for Trotsky was a moving and evolving analysis. When all the old conceptions of the nature of the Soviet Union and the bureaucracy had to be measured and reassessed against the survival, expansion, and self-replication of Stalinism, the, quote, official Trotskyist, end quote, Those who had taken Trotsky's side in 1939-40, led by James P. Kennan, joined soon after the reflux of Nazi Germany by Ernest Mandel, Michel Pablo, and others, turned ideas such as defense of the Soviet Union into frozen dogma and let that dogma commit them to defense of the Stalinist empire, the second power of the world. These, quote, orthodox Trotskyists came, as we shall see, to regard the Stalinist empire's expansion in war and the Stalinist empire's replication in Asia or Eastern Europe as advances for the working class. The orthodox Trotskyists turned Trotskyism back in Trotskyism's tracks, from what Trotskyism was in 1940 into a critical adjunct of the full-blown Stalinist empires. They defined Stalinist expansion as the expansion of a deformed working-class revolution. They maintained the belief in the workers' revolution, for which Trotsky was a belief that the labor movement could be, quote, turned around, end quote, so that it would play the necessary revolutionary role by mystifying it out of all reality and beyond all tests of reality. They even rechristened Stalinist Chinese peasant armies as workers' parties. In fact, this was only another way of declaring that the whole real perspective of the Bolsheviks dead. In fact, this was only another way of declaring that the whole real perspective of the Bolsheviks dead, everything that Trotsky had tried to avoid in the 1939-40 debate. It had the additional fault of not doing this clearly, but by way of naming something else as the working class revolution, and even for the working class. Their, quote, revolutionary perspectives, end quote, came to have as their immediate protagonist the Stalinist movement. They evolved a variant of degenerated worker state theory, supposedly Trotsky's, or developed from Trotsky, which switched all the directions, definitions, class affiliations, and lines of movement in Trotsky's actual theory, arriving at definitions of the Stalinist states, that these were societies in transition to socialism, that were the opposite of Trotsky's. They wound up accepting variants of the perspective of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, of socialism advancing from backwardness on the periphery of the world economy to the center. It was a procedure with the legacy of Trotsky belonging to the same order of things as the Stalinist scholasticism and mummery over, quote, Lenin, end quote, and with the same consequence that words and terms lost their meaning and filled with different content acquired new and sometimes opposite meanings, except that those engaged in this work were sincere and honest revolutionaries who retained a democratic criticism of Stalinism and made propaganda for and tried to organize to win. Trotsky's working class program against Stalinism, suspicious of innovation and motivated at root by the desire to do the best they could, they were cautious about challenging Trotsky's authority for fear that they would thereby succumb to the pressure of their own ruling classes. Okay, I'm still recording. I was nervous that I wasn't recording. Neo-Trotskyism was rooted in the abortive factional dispute of 1939-40, and in the lines prematurely drawn and defended there. For the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists who remained critical of Stalinism and advocates of either reform, as anachronistically for China until 1969, Yugoslavia, Cuba, etc., as if these were societies analogous to the USSR in the early period of degeneration in the 1920s, or political revolution in the USSR and Eastern Europe, it was a way to come to terms with the reality of Stalinism as a great collectivist anti-bourgeois power, which was also and simultaneously an anti-working class power. The Stalinist states, no matter how critical of them the Neo-Trotskyists were, usurped the place in Marxist theory of the working class in the anti-capitalist revolution in its first stage. All the typical wordplay and all the mystified and mystifying assertions that the working class, crushed and enslaved by the new state and denied the most elementary liberties and civil rights, ruled, could not change that fact. But what else could these be but worker states, degenerated like Russia or deformed at origin like the others? For Trotsky, the, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, idea existed within a complex web of ideas and perspectives. For this, his, quote, disciples, end quote, the system within which Trotsky saw the USSR as a worker state tended to shrivel to a, quote, totalitarian economism, end quote. That is there in Trotsky, but there is a lot more. For post-Trotsky Trotskyism, the bare fact of nationalized property and a system modeled in Stalin's USSR, and the rule of Stalinist forces committed to this model, defined a worker state whatever happened to be the workers. Defined a worker state whatever happened to the workers. It was, for this stage of history, carrying through the transition to socialism and was to be valued above the lives and liberties of the workers. Words in defense of the workers, however sincere and deep felt, could not balance out this logic. From the late 1940s, as the, quote, orthodox, end quote, accepted the extension of the Stalinist system in various ways as creating worker states, they could do it only by taking nationalized property as the ultimate criterion of the alleged class character of those states. Section 5. Millenarianism, quote, third period, end quote, Neo-Trotskyiism. The logic of the Neo-Trotskyist conditionally positive assessment of the new Stalinist, quote, revolutions, end quote, turned the Neo-Trotskyists to millenarianism, to the idea that socialist progress could be made by some force of, quote, history, end quote, or, quote, world revolution, end quote, above, beyond, and outside the living working class. Echoing the third period of Communist Party policy, in 1928-34, when it was a dogma laid down by Stalinist command that revolution was imminent always and everywhere, the Neo-Trotskyists professed certainty that the revolution was coming, and seers seeking confirmation of prophecies looked for redefined events to fit their expectations. This too had roots in some of Trotsky's sweeping predictions of revolution, when he could not clearly identify the agency other than the working class in the most general terms, and in his final view that capitalism was, quote, finished, end quote. The point is that the Neo-Trotskyists were led, by extrapolation from the idea that the USSR remained a worker state, and the fact that Stalinist forces could create other similar states, to accept, for now, as substitute for the working class, those who created in, for example, China as much as, quote, remained of 1917, end quote, in the USSR. There was logic in it. The first essay in millenarianism came out of World War II. In the period beginning with the end of the siege of Stalingrad, late 1942, the Neo-Trotskyists turned to perspectives for socialist gains and capitalist defeats spun around the advances of the, quote, Red, end quote, army, from the east to the very center of Europe. The new approach was most preposterous in its attempt to claim the Russian army as, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, a staple of the militant throughout the war, and its promotion of the idea that it was the nationalized economy that was winning USSR victories and inspiring the Russian workers and soldiers to fight. I'm going to repeat that sentence because it seems extremely important. The new approach was most preposterous in its attempts to claim the Russian army as, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, a staple of the militant throughout the war, and its promotion of the idea that it was the nationalized economy that was winning USSR victories and inspiring the Russian workers and soldiers to fight. These bizarre fatuities, on the level of crude advertising agency or public relations material, can too easily divert attention from the important and continuous core idea within the blatant nonsense, the acceptance of a positive revolutionary role for what in fact was Stalin's army and Stalin's state. There was talk of the, quote, Red, end quote, army rousing workers and inspiring them, as they had been in 1939 at the start of the events in Poland and Finland, as if nothing had been learned from the fact that, in Trotsky's words, quote, the invasions immediately bring about the transfer of power into the hands of the local Stalinist candidates for totalitarian rule, end quote, and, quote, not only the majority of the Finnish peasants, but also the majority of the Finnish workers proved to be on the side of their bourgeoisie, end quote. There was nonsensical pretense that there was not much to worry about in the sometimes mentioned counter-revolutionary character of the Kremlin, and, implicitly, if its, quote, Red, end quote, army of its, quote, red, end quote, army, because that would be lightweight compared to the, quote, revolutionary impulse, end quote, from Stalinist advance. There was utter unclarity about the relation between, quote, progressive, end quote, nationalizations imposed by the, quote, red, end quote, army, as in 1939 to 40 in Poland, and the working class as the agent of revolution. There was absolute subordination, in the last analysis, of all else to the supposed overriding principle of, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote. As late as March 1945, only a few weeks before the end of the war in Europe, this fictitious view of the, quote, red, end quote, army was the dominant one in the most important Neo-Trotskyist publication in the world, the U.S. Militant. The fundamental idea was, as we've seen, an identification of nationalized property with progress and of Stalinist policy, despite Stalin as a mere reflex of that progressive economy. Everything else was faded into the background. Without dropping their criticisms, especially of the communist parties in Western Europe, against which they fought bitterly, the U.S. official Trotskyists and those they influenced took up the posture of hopeful expectancy, of a push for socialist revolution connected with the advance of Stalin's army. The principle of, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, led directly to this. But to assert a straight line from Trotsky to the Neo-Trotskyist politics of 1942 to 45, you have to ignore Trotsky's prognosis of 1939 to 40. This could not have been the policy of the Trotsky who wrote what he did in 1939 to 40. No. After Stalingrad, the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists had taken a sharp fork in the road away from both the spirit and letter of what Trotsky wrote. Post-Trotsky, quote, Trotskyism, end quote, as it existed from 1942 was indeed part of the, quote, Stalingrad draft, end quote, that led vast numbers to join the communist parties. Foolish triumphalism about the victories of the workers' state was their response when history offered up the evidence that Trotsky had indicated would conclusively falsify the, quote, workers' state, end quote, thesis, the bureaucracy remaining stable in the convulsions of a world war. The leader of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, James P. Cannon, had himself put the perspective most sharply in a passage which I have already quoted from a letter to Trotsky. Quote, Stalin could take the path of Napoleonic conquest, and not merely against small border states, but against the greatest imperialist powers, only on one condition, that the Soviet bureaucracy in reality represents a new triumphant class, which is in harmony with its economic system and secure in its position at home, etc. If such really is the case, we certainly must revise everything we have said on the subject of bureaucracy up to now, end quote. James P. Cannon, Struggle for a Proletarian Party. When Stalin did conquer a large part of Germany, however, Cannon made no such revision. What Cannon revised or licensed others to revise, while holding to Trotsky's words, were the framework and criteria of Trotsky's entire approach, and Trotsky's root and branch rejection of socialism in one country. Neo-Trotskyism became a chaos of crazily distorted mirrors. At the end of the war, the workaday millenarian politics about, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, were still clothed in shreds of the old Trotskyism. As the Russian army consolidated itself as master of half of Europe, the USSR, though in fact the second power in the world and the great power of Europe and Asia, was, so the ventriloquized Trotsky, used as Lenin had long been used in the USSR, told the readers of the Militant, still in danger. Quote, only the world revolution can save the USSR for socialism, but the world revolution carries with it the inescapable blotting out of the Kremlin oligarchy. Reading the coverage of current affairs in the files of the, quote, Shachtmanite, end quote, Labor Action and New International, and the, quote, Orthodox, end quote, Militant, and the Fourth International is like being with on one side people who live on the planet Earth and read bourgeois newspapers, and on the other citizens of the moon peering at the affairs of Earth through a weak telescope. and relying on old photographs and accounts of life on Earth thousands of years in the past to decipher what is going on. Millenarianism is the all-turning note in post-war, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyism. Millenarianism was in full control by late 1942. By 1951, millenarianism was running riot, as the, quote, Fourth International, end quote, looked to a Russian victory in an imminent nuclear war, a, quote, Boer revolution, end quote, to put an end to capitalism and begin the transition to socialism on a world scale. But there was not a straight line. In the 1940s, there was an interruption, and perhaps the possibility of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, evolving in a different direction. Section 6, The Lessons of Italy. In their time, Burnham and Schechtman had written almost all the policy statements and analytical articles for the Socialist Workers' Party. After the split of April 1940, those who took over this work, but now with no help from Trotsky other than old texts, were Albert Goldman, Felix Morrow, and John G. Wright. In the 1939-40 dispute, Goldman had at first taken a flat and crass line of positive support for the Russian invasion of Poland. See Chapter 7. No one else had such a position. Morrow wrote daffy but logical extrapolations about, quote, the class significance of the Soviet victories, end quote. But these were honest people and thoughtful. Goldman's crassness in 1939 was evidently that of a downright man who wanted to say plainly and bluntly what he thought the position of his own side came down to. Soon, Goldman, Morrow, and a number of others, including Jean van Huysenoort, Trotsky's secretary for 7 years, became convinced that the events were falsifying the perspective of the Fourth International, which at this time, though it had activists in Europe and throughout the world, was an organization, not much more than a subcommittee of the Socialist Workers' Party. When Italian fascism fell in mid-1943, they began to face up to realities. Bourgeois democracy and Stalinism were the immediately powerful forces in Italy after 2 decades of fascist rule. The Trotskyists were a tiny force facing immense difficulties. Trotsky had understood and written about the probability of illusions in bourgeois democracy being generated by fascism. Trotsky had counterposed to the ravings of third-period Stalinism, for which, quote, revolution, end quote, was everywhere and continuously imminent, a rational Marxist assessment of what it took to make a revolutionary situation. Some of his general comments at the end of his life were vaguer. The Cannon Group had, quote, perspectives, end quote, for imminent European workers' revolution, as if it could be produced mechanically out of the war. Working class experience and Marxist and Bolshevik theory said that a socialist revolution could not be made and consolidated just by a sudden upsurge of a raw working class anger against capitalism, but required preparatory education and organization. The Cannonites implicitly had a view of revolution as emerging spontaneously from working class economic grievances. They occasionally paid lip service to Marxist ABCs by talking of the super-rapid growth of Trotskyist groups to leadership of the workers in Europe, in abstraction from any real perspectives for the evolution and self-development of working-class politics. This mixture, an implicit view of revolution as produced by raw rage, combined with a sectarian drive to, quote, build the party, end quote, which would unblock the spontaneous revolutionary lava, would become the central characteristic of certain Neo-Trotskyist currents in Britain and the Socialist Labor League Workers, is it World Revolutionary or Workers' Revolutionary Party? I think it might be Workers' Revolutionary Party, and its splinters. That would be like the Helyites. The Cannonites at first rejected democratic slogans. Talking as if victory was assured to the Trotskyists, they wanted to and did exclude from the reforming ranks of the Fourth International groups, which did not share their views on the Russian question. They were too busy trying to catch a little of the glory of, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, to notice that mass Stalinist movements existed in Europe, or to think of what that implied for socialist revolution. It was all deeply unrealistic and, in fact, ultra-left, with implicit underlying assumptions more akin to anarchism than Marxism. I don't know what the hell that has to do with it. I don't know what? God, Marxists are fucking stupid. The third period style ultra-leftism and the millenarianism, the expectation that other and non-human forces such as, quote, crisis and, quote, history would push through the revolution, would feed off each other for decades, in varying combinations and changing situations. By contrast, the, quote, Shachtmanite and, quote, Workers' Party not only proposed more earth-grounded assessments of and responses to world events, but subjected the Canaanites to a running fire of criticism, and in 1943 and afterwards that criticism came to be echoed inside the Socialist Workers' Party by Goldman and Morrow. Goldman and Morrow accused the Socialist Workers' Party of ultra-leftism and unrealism, and of living on and purveying a lethal mixture of dogmatism and empirical opportunism. After the fall of Mussolini, they advocated recognition of the realities of Europe and the use of democratic and transitional demands by the Trotskyists. Immediately, as in 1939 to 40, the political questions became snarled up with issues of party life and democratic procedure. Goldman and Morrow became an embittered opposition and began piecemeal and empirically to see that what the triumphs of Stalinism implied for the hopes of socialism in Europe, and they recognized the fact of Stalinist imperialism. There was a more eminent critic of the Socialist Workers' Party's, quote, softness, end quote, on Stalinism, Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's companion for 40 years, who still lived in Mexico and participated in the affairs of the movement. After the siege of Stalingrad, Natalia veered slowly towards the opposite fork of the political road to that taken of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists. She began to find the fantasies and delusions about, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, distasteful and nonsensical, and also politically dangerous. The Stalinist advance was a mortal threat to the European workers' prospects of socialism. Natalia began to insist. Natalia's pressure slowly produced a certain shift in emphasis. By the end of the war, a Fourth International had been recreated in Europe. Real discussion developed about what the future would be for Europe, the economic prospects for capitalism, assessment of the areas under Stalinist domination, and once more, the nature of the USSR. The Workers' Party considered itself a section of the Fourth International and was accepted by the Europeans as such. There were radical anti-Stalinist currents in the small European parties. Unity discussions took place between the Workers' Party and the Socialist Workers' Party in 1946 and 47. A group from the Socialist Workers' Party joined the Workers' Party. Goldman and some of his comrades, Morrow, expelled from the Socialist Workers' Party, dropped away from politics, and then a group from the Workers' Party joined the Socialist Workers' Party, CLR James and Raya Dunyevskaya, and 5 or 6 dozen people. The Workers' Party participated in the Second World Congress of the Fourth International in March 1948, which made a formal distinction in one of its documents between, quote, revolutionary bureaucratic collectivists, end quote, like the Workers' Party, and, quote, reactionary, end quote, ones, like Dwight MacDonald. Let me take a break.
Section 7. The Dilemmas of 1945 to 48. The 3 years between the end of the war and Tito's break with Stalin in July 1948 were an interregnum in the evolution of, quote, orthodox, end quote, Neo-Trotskyism, at the end of which, much depleted in forces, it returned to the millenarian course of 1942 to 5 and developed it into a whole new system of politics. Afterwards, it would develop by way of fraying partial recoils, eccentric movements from the doctrinal clarity around the perspective of, quote, Stalinist-led world revolution, end quote, which it had by the, quote, Third World Congress, end quote, of 1951. In 1945 to 8, however, there was real discussion and real fluidity. The USSR's power had expanded enormously. In Eastern Europe, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, had repressed the workers and set up, quote, coalition, end quote, regimes in which Stalinists had the key police, military, that is, state-controlling ministries. Indigenous Yugoslav Stalinists won power in a long war against German occupiers, Croat fascists, and Serbian monarchists. Having occupied Czechoslovakia and set up a, quote, mixed, end quote, government, the Russian army withdrew. Everywhere else, Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, the Russian army remained in occupation. Czechoslovakia had a mass communist movement before the war. The German Communist Party had been strong before 1933. Nowhere else in these states were there strong communist parties. There had been a strong independent Marxist tradition in Poland, but Stalinism had destroyed it, formally dissolving the Communist Party in 1938, shooting its leaders who had taken refuge in Moscow from Polish military dictatorship. A new Polish party had to be created for Russia's purposes in 1942 after Germany invaded the USSR. Everywhere, parties bred to rule were created out of old communist partiers, turncoat social democrats, and nondescript careerists. The top-ranking Stalinists returned from Moscow, quote, with pipes in their mouths, end quote, like Stalin, as the saying went. After 1949, most of those Stalinist leaders who had been at home in the underground and non-Moscow during the war would be purged, tried for imaginary crimes, and hanged or jailed. The bourgeoisie was weak or had been heavily discredited or smashed by the Nazis. Chauvinism akin to the tribalism of the Dark Ages and to Hitlerism characterized these Stalinist-run states in their relations with each other. The USSR kept the areas of Poland it had taken in 1939 and gave to Poland large areas of Russian-occupied Germany in return. 10 million Germans were cleared out of that territory at gunpoint, and with appalling suffering and many casualties. 3 million Germans were driven out of the Sudetenland in the Czechoslovak state. Large numbers of Hungarians, too, were driven from Czechoslovakia. So, just a side note, massive human displacement at the end of wars is by no means a peculiar event. How to evaluate these states? Plainly, they, like the Baltic states in 1940 and the areas of former Poland Stalin controlled, were being, quote, Sovietized, end quote. Nobody paying attention and reading newspapers could doubt it. If the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists did doubt it, it was because this, quote, Sovietization, end quote, presented them with all the questions that they had been avoiding since Stalingrad, or since 1939, or, since the Stalinist bureaucracy established its self-defined rule 2 decades earlier. The questions were writ too large to tolerate evasion, now that the USSR was the second power in the world, controlling a giant empire. The Neo-Trotskyists would try to evade them in what was by now the traditional way, juggling with words and definitions whose meanings were merely shifted. The, quote, orthodox, end quote, attitude on the Stalinization of Eastern Poland and the Baltic states had now to be reassessed. Why should it not be applied to the states now being turned into replicas of the USSR, and matching it for horrors with such things as the mass deportation of over 10 million Germans? If the same approach were now applied to the vastly greater Stalinist expansion, would that not destroy whatever coherence remained to the, quote, orthodox, end quote, position, compelling the Neo-Trotskyists to see police state repression of whole nations as somehow simultaneously being a form of socialist emancipation? But how, if the movement were not to fall into a gibbering lunacy, could it not be applied? Not applying it would disarrange the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Neo-Trotskyist position as much as applying it, only differently. The hard fact was that anti-capitalist revolutions were being made. However, the Stalinist transformations in Eastern Europe were defined. They were that, anti-bourgeois revolutions. For those who continued to see the USSR as a degenerated worker state, the assimilation of other countries into its model had to be defined as some variant of a workers' revolution, an anti-worker, counter-revolutionary, bureaucratic workers' revolution. The labor movements were being subverted and destroyed by the Stalinist police states, and replaced by totalitarian entities in the service of the totalitarianizing states. The working class was being subjugated at least as much as under fascism, and more than under the ramshackle pre-war loosely authoritarian regimes such as that of Hungary, for example. But if a categorization as worker states of the new Stalinist systems now congealed in 8 East European countries and North Korea, and by 1948 the Maoist armies were on the road to control of all of mainland China, was to be rejected, then how could such a rejection not logically imply that the whole, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, assessment of the USSR was untenable? If the dilemma were resolved by defining the new Stalinist states as being of the same nature as the USSR, that is, as being worker states of some sort, then another and more fundamental question was posed, though I don't think it ever was posed explicitly in those terms. What then was the theory according to which the USSR, with or without its empire of satellites, was a workers' state? The answer, quote, Trotsky's theory, end quote, which became the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyist answer, meaning that nothing basic had changed so long as nationalized property remained, would satisfy only those who had forgotten or not understood the whole trend of Trotsky's thought in the 1930s, and that the terms of his worker state theory had been, and what the terms of his worker state theory had been. The Soviet Union, even apart from its satellites and replicas, could not in 1945 be considered a worker state according to the approach indicated in Trotsky's evolving and constantly revised assessments in the 1930s. The bureaucracy had proved itself, in the hardest possible tests, to be no mere malignant tumor on society, no collective bandit seizing the economy for a short transitional period in the reflux of the workers' revolution before it gave way either to capitalism or to renewed workers' power, no freak in the historical interstices between workers' power and capitalist restoration or workers' renewal. Events had made Trotsky's old theory impossible. A new one had to be developed, and within the old name it was that, as we have seen, came to Bruno Rizzi's thesis of progressive bureaucratic collectivism as a stage on the road to socialism, renamed as, quote, degenerated worker states, end quote. Only a modified version of Trotsky's name for this very different theory of the degenerated worker state would remain. The change took time. Plain facts that could not be evaded had canceled out the entire structure of reasoning according to which Trotsky had hung on to the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, theory in 1939 to 40. The facts of the mid and late 1940s pointed imperatively to other conclusions, those provisionally indicated by Trotsky then, that the USSR was a species of new class society. The question in the discussion after 1944-5 was whether the collapse of Trotskyism into flat, quote, totalitarian economism, end quote, the idea that state ownership, or in the given case, totalitarian state ownership, supposedly rooted directly or more loosely, China, etc., in the October Revolution, was necessarily a working class, would spread and prevail, or be reversed. There was a large body of classical Marxist writing against the, quote, totalitarian economist, end quote, idea. It answered no real questions, but begged every question of working class socialism. Such a reduction of the criteria to statized economy was always the, quote, bottom line, end quote, the hard fact basis of Trotsky's theory. Trotsky was dealing with something new in history, and compelled to measure it by comparison with known phenomena, and by the pattern of previously existing modern class societies. Even so, Trotsky's denial of the autonomy of the autocracy after 1928 was wrong, was by the mid-1930s blamably wrong. The wartime fantasies were an abandonment of the responsibility to think realistically about the world. But not even the wartime fantasies about, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, completely and flatly replaced the working class with some other agency. The, quote, Red, end quote, Army was supposed to stimulate working class action. There were still more rational notions of ends and means hovering or flapping loosely in the air around the, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, fantasies. Now there were only hard brute facts. For a period, the hard facts undid the millenarianism of 1942-5. It needs to be stressed and kept in mind that the people involved were sincere and honest advocates of working-class socialism. They understood, and in a way that later generations of Neo-Trotskyists often would not, the monstrous aberration from any sort of socialism that the Stalinist system was. With fascism of recent and vivid memory, they understood the horror of even contemplating the notion that the fascist-style states that the USSR was erecting in Eastern Europe, in part with police forces staffed by recent fascists, could be accepted as a variant of a worker state. I actually had a conversation with a professor recently that's a Russian history professor who's German, and there's this kind of like idea that only in Western Germany did the post-war governments restaff the important positions in their society with former Nazis. Apparently that also was the case in East Germany. Maybe not to the same extent, but it's been the difference has been somewhat exaggerated, at least. So it's interesting that Matgamna is saying police forces staffed by recent fascists. But they needed to make sense of the world. They needed to ward off the conclusion of despair some drew from the repeated defeats of the working class, the idea that the working class could not play the role indicated in Marxist theory. The lessons of history proved the opposite. The Paris Commune, the 1917 Revolution, the worker struggles in Spain in the 1930s, and many others, lessons that are indelible. But they saw depression and defeats of the working class, side by side with victories against the bourgeoisie by people calling themselves, quote, communists, end quote, victories that achieved as much as remained of the October 1917 revolution. Revolutionary Stalinism beckoned as well as threatened. They needed to preserve hope for socialism, and paradoxically many of them, like the notorious U.S. general who said that he had destroyed a Vietnamese city, quote, in order to save it, end quote, preserved their hope for socialism in this epoch by killing the old idea and perspective of socialism and substituting for the old idea and perspective of socialism something else for, quote, now, or for, quote, this stage, end quote. These dilemmas opened a period of discussion in the reorganizing Fourth International. Max Shachtman at the end of the war write that the, quote, degenerated worker state, end quote, thesis was withering and dying. Shachtman was wrong, but that seemed to be the trend. Shachtman was right, too. The last echoes of Trotsky's worker state theory were dying. It would be replaced by quite different theories. The death of the old worker state was surely the only consistent and logical development of Trotsky's final position. In June 1946, the International Center, newly relocated in Europe, declared for the withdrawal of the USSR Army. What had been so recently and for so long, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, from Europe. The 1948 Congress document talked about, quote, defending what remained of the conquests of October 1917, end quote, in place of, quote, defending the Soviet Union, end quote. This reflected a very much changed mood. I'm not sure if this is going to be brought up, but I think it's interesting, especially for my own research purposes, that apparently there was some kind of, I guess, like, there's different people in party to this debate. I'm not sure exactly. I need to learn this because it's important. But like, I'm very interested in like what the Workers' Party, Independent Socialist League's relationship to the Fourth International in this period is. I think it has some kind of relationship. Because I know in like the late 40s or whatever, in Robert J. Alexander's book, it's kind of like an off, not an off, but it's just like kind of like a comment and then moved on. But there's some kind of alliance between the, I always fuck up the name, but Castoriadis and LaForest thing, I think it's Chalou Montal tendency, and the Workers' Party in the United States, they apparently agreed on enough to make that sensible. Keep in mind, it's important for the when discussing the history of ideas that Cornelius Castoriadis didn't initially adopt a state capitalist theory of the USSR. He thought that defining the USSR as state capitalist was like a sloppy application of familiar categories to something, to a new form of bureaucratic exploitative society. So his position initially was very much similar to the position of the bureaucratic collectivists. Eventually he would start calling it state capitalism. I don't know if that's due to the influence or collaboration with the Johnson-Forrest tendency, but that's something to consider as well. That initially Castoriadis and the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League types did share a comment, a similar perspective on the USSR. Anyway, Section 8, the British Revolutionary Communist Party. The British Revolutionary Communist Party would have been the main British Trotskyist party at this time. To my understanding, maybe I'll be checked by that in the article, in the rest of the piece, but I don't know. Illuminating here is the case of the British Revolutionary Communist Party. At its peak around 1945, this organization had 500 members. Thereafter, it steadily declined. By 1946, its leaders, Jock Haston, Millie Lee, and Ted Grant, had provisionally decided that the USSR, its satellites, and its Yugoslav replica were of a similar class character, state capitalists. After mulling this over for a while, they changed their minds. The USSR and the others were, they still thought, of the same sort, but they were ... worker states. The Revolutionary Communist Party became the major proponents of this position in the Fourth Internationalist movement, representing the opposite pole of the Workers' Party, which was arguing that Stalinism was a form of class system, bureaucratic collectivist, the Workers' Party majority, or state capitalist, the minority. That state capitalist minority would have been around CLR James and Raya Dunayevskaya, who were initially part of Shatman's Workers' Party and then went back to the Socialist Workers' Party before leaving Trotskyism altogether. The Revolutionary Communist Party held that the Stalinist satellites partook of the same class nature as the USSR and were thus worker states. For this phenomenon, a new adjective would be coined. They had not degenerated, as the USSR had, from a workers' revolution, so these were, quote, deformed, end quote, worker states. A majority supported neither pole, and the Revolutionary Communist Party were much despised and much condemned for their position. The Shatmanites said that the Revolutionary Communist Party were at least logical. Other supporters of the thesis that the USSR remained a worker state spurned the Revolutionary Communist Party for creating a reductio ad absurdum of it. The Revolutionary Communist Party leaders were regarded as people who had gutted Trotskyism and bestowed on Stalinism undeserved recognition as a progressive anti-capitalist force. Ernest Mandel and others dealt with the issue by declaring the satellites, most of them occupied, except Czechoslovakia, by Russian troops, with governments dominated by Stalinists, to be state capitalist, while the USSR remained a worker state. Mandel, the major academic theoretician of Neo-Trotskyism from the late 1940s, managed to combine these two positions with a third, great enthusiasm for the victorious Chinese Maoists. And to my understanding, Mandel would go on to call Mao's China a worker state, however critically, for at least the first 20 years of its existence. New section, Tito. The March 1948 Second World Congress in Paris consisted of 50 delegates and represented 22 organizations in 19 countries, including the Workers' Party of the USA. The shape of the world, which would last with secondary modifications until the collapse of the USSR 43 years later, was now plain. Capitalism had stabilized and begun to revive, though much of Europe was still in ruins. The main changes still to work their way through would come from a range of anti-colonial struggles. Just before the Congress, on the 25th of February 1948, the Stalinists in Czechoslovakia organized a coup which was the last act in the Stalinization of all of Russian-occupied Eastern Europe, a coup in which mass working-class support allowed the Stalinists, who already controlled the key ministries, to stage something, with mass demonstrations, like a parody of a workers' revolution. The tone of the 1948 Congress resolutions is that of defeat and perplexity. Footnote. The Congress launched the slogan for the transformation of the small Trotskyist propaganda groups, some very small, into, quote, parties of mass working class struggle, end quote. The same call had been made by a previous conference in 1946, but this time it was made in the face of a major decline of all the groups. About half the membership of the French group, which was the largest in Europe, quit soon after the Congress, and its paper, previously weekly, appeared only 3 times between April and November 1948. The British Revolutionary Communist Party was also on the point of collapse. End footnote. The USSR remained a worker state. How? Why? Quote, the social revolution still lives in what remains of the conquest of October, bracket, i.e. the nationalized property, end bracket, and in the vanguard layers of the working class, end quote, declared the Congress document. 14 years after the start of the Great Terror, and 20 years after the consolidation of totalitarian rule, the idea of the, quote, vanguard layers of the working class, end quote, still being able to determine the class character of the state was surreal. The Congress resolution placed much stress on the, quote, instability of the social relations, end quote, and the need to study the trends by which, quote, the progressive character of the Russian economy, tends to become eliminated by the bureaucracy, end quote. End quote. The possibilities of reaction and regression in all fields, including the economic, within the framework of these, bracket, nationalized, end bracket, property relations, have been shown to be infinitely vaster than anyone could have thought, end quote. With the experience of Nazi rule fresh in their minds, the Congress delegates described the USSR as, quote, the most totalitarian police dictatorship in history, end quote. All the welter of qualifications and contrived arguments reflected minds at the end of their tether, about to flip back into the plain, quote, totalitarian economist, end quote, definition of a worker state by nationalized property alone. In fact, the Congress solved nothing. By holding to the position that the USSR is a worker state, the Congress indicated how the mainstream would solve the problem. But the Congress itself stood between two open doors on either side of the final bivouacking. What the fuck does that mean? Is that an actual word? I don't know. This might be a typo. bivouacking. Let's see. Bivouac. That's a word.
Bivouac. Bivouac.
Bivouac. Stay in temporary camp without cover. He bivouacked on the north side of the town. That's a fun word. That final bivouacking of the old Trotskyist movement. Within 3 months, the quote orthodox end quote Neo-Trotskyists would troop, no, stampede, through the one marked quote Stalinism is revolutionary end quote. Tito's Yugoslavia was a fully formed, smaller replica of the USSR. If, as the Congress said, it was capitalist, then it was a fascist state. Tito had won power with no dependence on the Russian army. In July 1948, Yugoslavia and the USSR fell out violently. Yugoslavia resisted the predatory, imperialist relations with the USSR imposed on the satellites. Overnight, for the Russian propagandists, Tito became a fascist, a long-time, quote, agent, end quote, in the communist movement and the new Trotsky. To get a bit of a flavor for like the pre-World War II Yugoslav Communist Party, check out the piece I have on the channel by I think it's Michael S. Fox, about Ante Siliga. And his relationship, it was like a dissident Marxist who spent years in Soviet concentration camps. I don't know if they were quite called the Gulag, where he was saying, but you could also probably just say Gulag for general purposes. He spent 5 years in the Gulag and then came out criticizing the USSR from a left-wing perspective and getting involved with arguing with Trotsky on the point, kind of similar to Boris Suvarin. But I think also similar to Boris Suvarin, Ante Siliga, in addition to James Burnham, and arguably to some extent Max Shachtman, would take right-wing turns in their own different ways. Not that was acceptable, of course, but I can empathize with their degree of not with their choices, but I can empathize with like the disgust that might have motivated them to make that choice out of not make that choice, but that might motivate them to make a choice. Unfortunately, I think personally they made the wrong choices, especially in the case of Siliga, who I think became a Croat fascist. I get them all mixed. I get the fucking Stasi, is that, or Stasi, Utase, that's Croatia, right? But to get a feel for like the Stalinist repression and bullshit that happened in the Yugoslav Communist Party prior to World War II, check out that piece. Anyway, Tito's Yugoslavia was a fully formed, smaller version, smaller replica of the USSR. Shit, no, I've already read all that. Where am I? Overnight, for the Russian propagandists, Tito became a fascist, a long-time, quote, agent, end quote, in the communist movement, and the new Trotsky. Tito acted to repress pro-Stalin people in his own state. A war of propaganda opened up. The Stalinists called for the removal of Tito. Russian invasion seemed a distinct possibility. Tito had a mass base of support and appealed to the Yugoslav people. Not immediately, but over time, the Tito dictatorship, while retaining all the Stalinist basics, including the Byzantine cult of the leader, loosened up, and organs of firmly controlled popular representation appeared. The Yugoslavs criticized Russian Stalinism. They would soon designate the USSR as state capitalist, and the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists would polemicize with them in defense of the working class character of Stalin's state. They would denounce the orthodox Trotskyists for being soft on the USSR. Now millenarianism, looking to other forces, half miraculously to make the revolution for the workers, came back to the, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyists with a force and an all-conquering logic that showed the period of, quote, Trotsky's Red Army, end quote, to have been a mere experimental half-rehearsal of a half-written play. Immediately, the leaders of the Fourth International recognized that what on its merits had seemed a Yugoslav fascist capitalist state was really a socialist state. All Tito's typical Stalinist talk of socialism and workers' power, which had been dismissed as cant at the 1948 Congress, was now understood to be good stuff. The recent fascist, capitalist state was to be supported against the degenerated worker state. Everything was redefined. An open letter was quickly dispatched to the, quote, comrades, unquote, at the head of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Speculation on the possibility of fishing in the pro-Tito current, which emerged in the Western left, were part of it. But this was a genuine new, quote, revelation, end quote. And at the Congress, the, quote, world revolution, end quote, had seemed to be in a cul-de-sac, apart from the colonial struggles. Now everything was on the move. By April 1949, the International Executive Committee was ready to recognize that the countries where Russian Stalinism had overthrown capitalism and created societies in its own image were after all worker states, deformed worker states. They had adopted the position of the long despised and much derided Revolutionary Communist Party majority. Their all-reshaping idea now was that they should not be, quote, sectarian, end quote, towards the, quote, living revolution, end quote. None of the implication that had led them to despise the Revolutionary Communist Party had disappeared. Now they drew conclusions that repelled even the British. Alone of all the Trotskyist currents in the world, the British Revolutionary Communist Party, in a front-page article in Socialist Appeal by Jock Haston, had welcomed the Stalinist final coup in Czechoslovakia in February 1948. Now Haston could with justice criticize the, quote, orthodox, end quote, for Tito worship. Acceptance of the, quote, living revolution, end quote, in Yugoslavia toppled the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Neo-Trotskyists over into acceptance of Stalinism as revolutionary. Now they saw that the Russian bureaucracy had played a tremendous international revolutionary role, as in the USSR after 1920. So had Tito played a great revolutionary role, so would Mao, so would others. Implicitly, this acceptance of the revolutionary role of the Stalinist bureaucracy internationally was a long-ranging backward revision of Trotsky's view of the bureaucracy, and implied a much-needed understanding of its independent role after 1928, but it was accompanied by positive acceptance of the Stalinist new international achievements, and led not to a criticism and a correction of Trotsky's conclusion that the USSR is a workers' state, but to a thoroughgoing revision of Trotsky's account of how and why it was a degenerated workers' state. The label, quote, workers' state, end quote, was kept from Trotsky, little else was. In the new millenarian worldview, the socialist revolution was moving forwards. It made tremendous strides in the suppression of capitalism. Hesitantly and with zigzags, the, quote, orthodox, end quote, had levered the, quote, worker state, end quote, theory up away from Trotsky's whole method of analysis, so that eventually it rested on a single point, nationalized property. Then pivoting on that single point, the theory was turned around so that it came to be not a one-sided version of what Trotsky had argued, but in many respects its opposite. A nationalized economy defined a worker state. The Stalinists created nationalized economies. Therefore, the Stalinists were a force who made worker states. Therefore, for some, Stalinist power defined a worker state, and was in fact the political core of a worker state. nationalized economy being the only economic result. As in Trotsky's theory, nationalized economy was the economic result, demonstrating the continued vitality of traces from the 1917 Workers' Revolution. China would be seen by many of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, as a, quote, workers' state, end quote, as soon as the Stalinists took power, long before they got round to comprehensive statization of the economy, and in the terms of the, quote, orthodox, end quote, rightly so. Though the, quote, orthodox, end quote, still upheld a norm of democratic workers' power, what the orthodox meant by, quote, workers' state, end quote, in immediate politics was a state where the workers were crushed uninhibitedly by a monopolistic bureaucracy. The inversion of meanings was as complete as any that Stalin had worked. The, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists had saved their, quote, belief in socialism, end quote, by altering their socialist perspective and by redefining socialism, for now, out of recognition. Now they regain their vision of a world revolution by raising it above and separated from the real labor movements. They hitch their hopes to the Stalinist movement and cut loose from the only possible agency of real socialism, the working class. The wide variety of Trotskyist groups, promoting basic positions, proves how much freedom there is to juggle in the framework of the, quote, new Trotskyism, end quote, defined in 1939 to 51. Yet there was in all the strands a logical connection with the basic theory of the Soviet Union. If the USSR was any sort of worker state or advanced beyond capitalism and towards socialism, then the states modeled after it by the, quote, Red Army, end quote, or Tito or Mao were advances beyond capitalism, perhaps only a first stage of advance, but a decisive stage. History had found its way out of the impasse of the 1930s. One could not be, quote, subjective, end quote, about it. In plain language, this meant that other forces were doing at least the first stage of the job. That was the workers in Marxist theory. In backward countries, the solution, pro tem, to the crisis of leadership over the working class was to accept that history, for now, had dispensed with the working class. Section 10. The, quote, Third World Congress, end quote. A new Trotskyism is founded. In the next few years after 1948, the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Neo-Trotskyists would reconceptualize the world as one of ongoing struggle between the proletarian class camp, the USSR's empire, and the USSR's empire's allies, and imperialism. Russian imperialism was revolutionary anti-imperialism. All the signs were turned around. Trotskyism experienced as profound an inner transformation of ideas as the Communist International after 1923. We have seen that one reason for the great difficulties that Trotsky experienced with understanding Stalinism was that he had thought of the autocracy's rule not as a regime, quote, in and of itself, end quote, but as a freak short-term phenomenon of transition. Since the expected rupturing of forms of state property by the bourgeoisie or of bureaucratic political power by the working class had not happened, only reconceptualization of the USSR opened a way out of the cul-de-sac. Mesmerized by the survival and success and the challenge to capitalism Stalinism embodied, and fearful of innovation, Trotsky's followers, when they came to the unavoidable reconceptualization, veered off in the opposite direction to that indicated by Trotsky in 1939, to critical but positive reassessment of Stalinism. Between Tito's break with Stalin and their April 1949 decision that the states of the Russian Empire were all worker states, They performed a spectacular reconceptualization. The only changes had been the transition there from the looser post-1945 regimes to the full-scale airtight Stalinist totalitarian terror system. Yet what the Second World Congress had defined as state capitalist systems with fascist-style regimes became progressive variants of working-class rule and would be designated as, quote, in transition to socialism, end quote. Regimes in which, since 1945, the fascist-like destruction of labor movements, of civil liberties, and of all workers' rights by Russian Quisling regimes had been observed, condemned and summed up in the resolution of the 1948 Congress, were now, quote, reconceptualized, end quote. You would have to look to the most spectacular volte-faces of the Stalin turn for a parallel switch. Here there was not the complexities and difficulties that Trotsky had unavoidably faced in analyzing the stage-by-stage degeneration of the Russian Revolution. Evolving, open-ended, seeming to be radically unstable by all available measures, the USSR could not look to Trotsky as it does in retrospect to those who know the whole story and approach it as history. The 1948 to 49, quote, official, end quote, Trotskyists approached their analysis from the other end. They had seen the systems for something like what they were, and then they, quote, saw, end quote, them again in a blinding light of revelation. So far had norms and standards been pulped. For the satellite states, the Neo-Trotskyists advocated the same program as for the USSR. They did not abandon the working class. For the autonomous, quote, worker states, end quote, Yugoslavia, China, Cuba, they could not do that. They would not do that. They would adopt the posture of loyal critics, with suggestions to make for reform. When some Chinese Trotskyists fled to Hong Kong from the Maoists, those who did not were killed or incarcerated for 3 or 4 decades. Michel Pablo, secretary of the new, quote, Fourth International, end quote, dismissed them as, quote, refugees from a revolution, end quote. A similar thing happened in 1945, I believe, in Vietnam. Check out the work of No Von for that. But also some of the... check out some of the pieces I have on here by Lauren Goldner for some critiques of Third Worldism. And also, just to be clear, this is not something. Just by saying that about Mao's China, that's also true of other places. I don't know how long, but the Trotskyists were locked up in Cuba, and also, to my understanding, when Mercador, Trotsky's assassin, was released from prison in Mexico and took refuge in Cuba, which he was welcomed openly and warmly in Cuba. I believe, I'm not exactly sure, but I think Che might have met him. I've read that Che met him on the bridge, but maybe that's not true. I don't know. Maybe it was Fidel. I don't know. He assassinated him in 1940. I think he was in prison for like 18 years, so it would have been, I believe it would have been the early 1960s. So Che could have been around. When was Che When was Che killed? Was it 65? I just want to look this up. '67. Oh, okay. Anyway, comradely open letters were written to the victorious Chinese Stalinists who, and would be written to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as late as 1962. Footnote. It was 1969 before the Mandel Fourth International came out for a, quote, political revolution, end quote, in Mao's China. Where am I? End footnote. Bowing down before success was part of it. So was a supine attitude to history that was the opposite of that appropriate to representatives of a revolutionary class at bay. The reconstituted Fourth International consisted of very small groups, mostly only a few dozen strong, and an international leadership dependent on the bestowed authority of James P. Cannon, raised as a literary apparatus of commentators and fantasy strategists above a very weak movement. As it turned out, they would not long remain tractable to Cannon's bidding or long let themselves be held in check by Cannon's, quote, old Trotskyist, end quote, inhibitions. The implications drawn from the 1948-9 turn and its working through were now that the transition to world socialism was moving forward of its own momentum. It was surging forwards and seizing on and using any organizational instrument to hand. As Ernest Mandel put it in January 1951, the, quote, worldwide revolutionary upsurge continues to expand and deepen. And even if between 1948 and 1950 it saw a temporary retreat in Europe, today it pulls all Asia in its wake. Tomorrow it will cross the Atlantic and attack capital in its last bastion. The development of this upsurge is the, quote, almost automatic product of the extreme decomposition of capitalism. Sorry, that's not a quote, that was dirt on my screen. The development of this upsurge is the almost automatic product of the extreme decomposition of capitalism, is in the absence of a sufficiently powerful revolutionary leadership that this revolutionary upsurge temporarily takes new and transitional forms, like those we have seen in Yugoslavia and we see now blooming in Asia. Quote, oh shit, there's still a continuation of a previous quote. Jesus Christ. I'm spacing out. This is a continued quote by Ernest Mandel from 1951. For 10 years, the advance of the world revolution has taken the most diverse and unexpected forms. The most outlandish and confusing combinations, ... Not to understand this concrete development of the world revolution, and to retrench behind schema of a, quote, ideal, end quote, world revolution, is to turn one's back on the real movement in the name of a chimera, to push communism back from the level of science to that of utopia, end quote. It's from Mandel's, quote, 10 Theses, end quote. There was an ongoing evolutionary process, and no longer depended on the workers, at least not for now, where democracy and every sort of self-determination or self-rule had been eliminated, not because to the Neo-Trotskyists it was undesirable, but events had proved that, for now, it was inessential and unnecessary for the creation of this sort of worker state. So now, too, was the action of the working class itself. Even the action of revolutionary socialists, substituting for the working class, which would itself be far from Marxism, was eliminated. In its place were peasant armies or the Russian army. For Trotsky, the bureaucracy was a corrupt, usurping stopgap locum. For Neo-Trotskyists, it came to be the prime agency. The evolution-revolution was an ongoing, self-moving process, raised out from reality and abstracted from the actualities of Stalinist revolutions, which in the true third period, or religious prophet style, were merely phenomenal expressions of the grand design, capital G, grand, capital D design. This process was seen as something that moved as though, quote, striving, end quote, teleologically, towards some goal already determined. The, quote, transition to socialism, end quote, was moving forward, and continuously, of the, quote, transition to socialism's, end quote, own momentum, taking many and varied forms, and with varying types of protagonists. The ongoing world revolution, as if impatient with delay, abstracted from actual revolutions. The actual revolutions were given the name of proletarian revolution, but in the old meanings of such words they were nameless and classless, manifestations of a process elevated into a shadowy historical actor, a specter stalking the earth. This was ideologically the, quote, historical process, end quote, rationalizing and petrifying reality, not Marxist analysis. A man like Ernest Mandel rationalized the, quote, historical process, end quote, including Stalinism, as earlier Karl Kautsky had rationalized the doings of the dominant parliamentary and trade union leaders in German social democracy. Natalia Sedova wrote bitter words when she broke with the Fourth International Code. Just as a side note, Sedova's letter of resignation from the Fourth International is on this channel. Quote, this is a quote from Natalia Sedova, Trotsky's widow. In 1932 and 33, the Stalinists, in order to justify their shameless capitulation to Hitlerism, declared that it would matter little if the fascists came to power, because socialism would come after and through the rule of fascism. Only dehumanized brutes, without a shred of socialist thought or spirit, could have argued this way. Now, notwithstanding the revolutionary aims which animate you, you maintain that the despotic Stalinist reaction which has triumphed in Europe is one of the roads through which socialism will eventually come. This view marks an irredeemable break with the profoundest convictions always held by our movement, and which I continue to share. Most insupportable of all is the position on the war to which you have committed yourselves. The Third World War, which threatens humanity, confronts the revolutionary movement with the most difficult problems, the most complex situations, the gravest decisions. Our position can be taken only after the most earnest and freest discussion. But in the face of all the events of recent years, you continue to advocate and to pledge the entire movement to the defense of the Stalinist state. You are even now supporting the armies of Stalinism in the war, which is being endured by the anguished Korean people. I cannot and will not follow you in this. I know very well how often you repeat that you are criticizing Stalinism and fighting Stalinism. But the fact is that your criticism and your fight lose their value and can yield no results, because your criticism and your fight are determined by and subordinated to your position of defense of the Stalinist state. Whoever defends this regime of barbarous oppression, regardless of the motives, abandons the principles of socialism and internationalism, end quote. Natalia Sedova. What might be called the peak experience of clearest, what might be called the peak experience, the clearest possible proof that the picture painted here is not false or artificial, was the Neo-Trotskyist preparations for war. A third world war was almost universally expected. Instead, the USSR developed an atom bomb, and the era in history characterized by a balance of nuclear terror began. Though that is a view in hindsight. In 1950, a proxy war began in Korea when the Stalinist North invaded the South. World war seemed imminent, all out, partially nuclear war. What did it mean for socialists? Basing themselves on the experience of Stalinist resistance movements in the Second World War, and on the militant discipline of the non-Russian communist parties, the apparatus of the Fourth International developed the following thesis. A Third World War will in fact trigger the European Socialist Revolution. The, quote, Red Army, end quote, and the indigenous communist parties will conquer Europe and make that revolution. It will be a combined war revolution. Michel Pablo, who was by now the main international leader of the current, would speculate that this would lead to, quote, centuries of deformed worker states, end quote. What others feared as Armageddon, and what Trotsky, writing about the prospect of a world war after the Second World War, said would be, quote, the grave of civilization, end quote, was for these millenarians. Now they had hitched themselves firmly to the Stalinist empire and its world-conquering mission, the Socialist Revolution. The red flag, decorated with a picture of Trotsky in military uniform in front of a hammer and sickle, and the red flag waving behind the four horsemen of the apocalypse, fire, famine, pestilence, and war, would have properly emblematized this vision. Michel Pablo explained in 1949, quote, "The two notions of revolution and of war, far from being opposed or distinguished as two markedly different stages of revolution, are brought closer and interlaced to the point of being merged in place and time. In their place is the notion of the war-revolution, which emerges, and on which should be based the perspectives and the orientation of the revolutionary Marxists of our epoch. Such language may perhaps shock the lovers of dreams and, quote, pacifist, end quote, bluster, or those who are already lamenting the apocalyptic fate of the world, which they foresee as following an atomic war and an expansion of Stalinism. But these sensitive hearts have no place among the militants, and especially among the revolutionary Marxist cadres of this epoch. The most terrible of all, where the sharpness of the class struggle has risen to its paroxysm, is objective reality which pushes this dialectical complex of the revolution-war to the first place, which implacably destroys, quote, pacifist, end quote, dreams, and which leaves no respite in the simultaneous gigantic deployment of the forces of the revolution and of war, and their battle to the death, ... To the efforts of the bourgeoisie and of imperialism to mobilize the masses in their war against the USSR, the, quote, people's democracies, end quote, China, and other Asiatic revolutions underway, and to crush the communist parties in the revolutionary movement of their respective countries, broad layers will respond by revolt, open struggle, armed struggle, the new resistance, capital R resistance, by the way, but this time with an infinitely clearer class character. It is possible that on the basis of these mass reactions, and of the chaos and aggravation which such a war would rapidly create, different communist parties will see themselves obliged to undertake, pushed by the masses, pushed by their own base, a struggle which would go beyond the Soviet bureaucracy's own objectives. Such a war, far from stopping the struggle, which is currently going on to the disadvantage of imperialism, would intensify it and bring it to its paroxysm. It would shatter all balance, pulling all forces into the struggle, accelerating the process which has already begun, namely that of the convulsive transformation of our society, which will only subside with the triumph of international socialism. The fate of Stalinism will be decided precisely in this period of gigantic overturns. People who despair of the fate of humanity because Stalinism survives and even wins victories are cutting down history to their measure. They had wished that the whole process of transformation of capitalist society into socialism would be accomplished in the span of their short lives, so they could be rewarded for their efforts for the revolution. As for us, we affirm that what we wrote in the first article we devoted to the Yugoslav affair. This transformation will probably take a whole historical period of some centuries, which will be filled in the meantime with transitional forms and regimes between capitalism and socialism, necessarily distanced from, quote, pure, end quote, forms and norms, ... Those who think they can respond to the anxiety and the embarrassment of some people at the so-called victories of Stalinism by minimizing the objectively revolutionary significance of these facts are obliged to take refuge in a sectarianism, anti-Stalinist at all costs, which scarcely conceals under its aggressive appearance its lack of confidence in the fundamental revolutionary process of our epoch. This process is the most certain pledge for the inevitable final defeat of Stalinism, and it will be realized all the more rapidly the quicker the overthrow of capitalism and of imperialism progresses and gains a bigger and bigger part of the world, end quote. Michel Pablo, where are we going? Pablo restated the perspective in a pamphlet of August 1952. Quote, "The coming war," end quote. That's what the pamphlet is called. The war would be, quote, that of united imperialism, led by Washington, against the capital R revolution in all its forms. The forces which threaten the capitalist regime are those of the capital R revolution in all its forms, the non-capitalist states, the colonial revolution, the international revolutionary movement. In all these elements is expressed, directly or indirectly, in more or less clear and conscious form, the fundamental objective process of the world socialist capital R revolution of our century, end quote. Obviously, the capital R part is not in there, but the R's are capitalized in revolution. End quote, Pablo. And that's from a piece called The Coming War. This drum-tight vision of apocalyptic Stalinist-led world revolution would change as tension relaxed in 1953 and after, and the world settled into the long years of nuclear stalemate. The method of relying on forces other than the working class would not change, though the forces would change and proliferate. The pattern has been set out. There is no point in tracing it further. The number of permutations it produced is immense. Section 11. The 1953 split. One break in the pattern, which created its own kaleidoscopic variations, remains to be indicated. Against the logical drift. One second. Something came up with my computer. Gotta wait for it to pass. Excuse me. One break in the pattern, which created its own kaleidoscopic variations, remains to be indicated. The current, against the logical drift, there would be recoil. The Pablo Mandel current itself would recoil from the wild speculations of 1949 to 52. These were sincere socialists and anti-Stalinists. However inadequate their ideas seem with hindsight. The most important recoil was that of James Buchanan. In 1953, James Buchanan led a split in the Fourth International. The monofactional and very shrunken rump that had in effect refounded itself as a different movement in mid-1951 at the so-called Third World Congress. It was an utterly incoherent recoil, which kept all the basic ideas of the 1951 Congress, but demanded more emphasis on the building of Trotskyist parties. Cannon, who had pioneered millenarianism in the 1940s, reshaped the Fourth International after the war, and directed the, quote, world leaders, end quote, now recoiled from them. 1953 was an incoherent and hysterical lurch towards what had been, quote, Shachtmanism, end quote, in the early 1940s. The emphasis on the centrality of building Trotskyist parties. Buchanan and his comrades were held at bay. Buchanan and his comrades were held as by a chain to over a decade of confused history that culminated in the Third World Congress. In his own way, incoherently, Cannon tried to do what Shachtman and Shachtman's comrades had begun to do in 1939. There is evidence that Cannon thought Cannon could, quote, lift his finger, end quote, and Pablo would fall. Cannon was mistaken. The significance of Cannon's break, joined by groups in Britain and France, is that all coherence was lost. Like ripples spreading out from a stone dropped in still water, the reverberations spread. Groups proliferated, some quite mad. A useful distinction in sorting out these groups is between people honestly trying to understand the world and trying to function politically, and both Cannon and his opponents in 1953 were that, and the charlatans. An increasingly conspicuous section of the Neo-Trotskyist movement consisted of charlatans. Groups like the French Lambertists and the later British Helyites, the Morenist in Latin America, people who would say or do anything for catch-penny advantage, for whom the old idea that the political program builds the party had been inverted, and for whom the exigencies of party building dictated politics, end quote, the program, end quote. I think Matgamna would probably say, or I think he does actually say, something similar about the Socialist Workers' Party, which is the not part of Orthodox Trotskyism insofar as it adopts Cliff's state capitalist conception of the USSR, amongst other things, while remaining fairly conventionally Trotskyist in other ways. They in order to build their party, they latch on hostility to Israel and the West broadly conceived in order to appeal to current popular sentiments, as opposed to having a consistent secular democratic socialist program appealing to Islamism, amongst other things. At least that's my understanding. I mean, I'm not sure, but it's consistent with the politics. And that seems like a general thing. Whatever is like people aren't willing to take controversial, though logically consistent stands because of what it might do to their organizations and sorry to say this, but their careers. Which could also be formulated in a way just saying, they're standing within their milieu. If you take a positive two-state solution stance, for instance, or, and especially, criticizing Stalinism in this period when Stalinism was ostensibly having all these successes is a brave thing to do. It's stepping out of the fold of conventional left discourse of both the Stalinist parties and their quasi-critical fellow travelers, right? It takes some courage. It takes some guts. It takes some, not just to be obviously there's a certain desire, at least in myself, and I'm sure other people, to be contrarian or whatever, or at the very least not just accept bag arguments for things that may be true. But it does take guts to actually when this is your world, right? To actually stand up and hold your ground on basic principles when people seem to be abandoning those principles in order to gain political leverage or social capital or something like that. Some people might say that social capital, that term, just causes confusion in people, and I think there's a degree to which that's true. But I think the, Bourdieu? What's his name? Is his name? Yeah, Bourdieu. This concept of social capital is actually extremely useful, even if it is not to be confused with how Marxists would conceptualize capital. Anyway, sorry, I'm just talking out my ass. Section 12, conclusion. The Communist Manifesto and Trotskyism. Quote, history does nothing. History, quote, possesses no immense wealth, end quote. History, quote, wages no battles, end quote. It is man, real living man, that does all that possesses and fights. Quote, history, end quote, is not a person apart, using man as a means for its own particular aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing man's aims. End quote, Marx and Engels, The Holy Family. Trotsky tried to make sense of the bureaucratic collectivist Stalinist society in terms of classical Marxism and the 1917 version of those ideas. His tardiness in drawing the sharp and clear conclusions which can be seen now as necessary wreaked havoc with the Marxism he set out to defend. He was forced to follow in the steps of Stalinism, putting his own gloss on events while critically accommodating to the brute reality of the USSR. In Trotskyism and Neo-Trotskyiism, there was a transformation out of recognition of the ideas and language of Marxism. Throughout the 1930s, Trotsky stretched and adapted the old Bolshevik and Marxist ideas and terminology to accommodate the new things, adding qualifying adjectives and using terms which implied quote marks, such as quote caste, end quote, for the USSR's rulers. Beyond very narrow limits, such a procedure could not but corrupt meaning and confuse definition. By the end, it had become a scholastic game, or even a form of juggling with words, akin to word magic and superstition. For example, what more than superstition was the idea that to hold back from giving the USSR bureaucracy a name, ruling class, implied in all Trotsky's concrete descriptions of its reality, would somehow ward off the disturbing implications of that reality for the old Marxist schemes of history. The toll taken by this attempt to, quote, save the old theory, end quote, was that the meanings of most of the terms of that theory were changed. For example, quote, defense of the USSR, end quote, against a small non-imperialist nation in the USSR-Finnish War, the, quote, defense, end quote, that led anti-Stalinists to back those whom Trotsky had called the, quote, rapists in the Kremlin, end quote, in their turn to take over Finland, was not the same thing as the old, quote, defense of the USSR against imperialist attack, end quote. Within the old terminology, there took place what in other fields had been called a, quote, shift of paradigm, end quote. This happened again and again as events stunted brutally into each and every one of Trotsky's theoretical positions on Stalinism, pushing them off what had seemed solid ground. Trotsky was working within a false theoretical frame from as early as the mid-1920s when he saw the Stalinist, quote, center, end quote, as a minor threat compared to the Bukharnite, quote, right wing, end quote. Hill-Tickton says, and I think it seems sensible to me, that Trotsky held on to the notion of Stalinism as centrism until he died. Trotsky's frame and the impact of reality on it combined to create doctrinal havoc with the very basics of communism. It was not enough that Trotsky conscientiously restated those basics from time to time. The fact that Stalinist society calling itself socialist was misidentified by its most bitter critics as a worker state inevitably debased the meaning of all the key words involved. There was a further infusion of new meanings into the old words as Stalinism spread after 1944. The process in Trotskyism paralleled what Stalinism did to Marxism and represented a degree of ideological conquest by Stalinism of its most consistent critics. By around 1950, Neo-Trotskyiism had stood on its head the Communist Manifesto and its basic ideas, that is, the foundation of Marxism as it was in 1917. 1. Marx and Engels made socialism, quote, scientific, end quote, by converting socialism from a moral scheme counterposed to capitalism into a logical, although revolutionary dialectical development from material preconditions created by capitalism. And Neo-Trotskyism, that is, mainstream revolutionary socialism for a whole era, a pre-Marxist sectarian rejection of capitalism on a world scale, and an identification with Stalinist states as a progressive alternative because they were anti-capitalist, had replaced this idea of the relationship of capitalism to socialism. The idea that capitalism, and even on some level imperialism, is progressive was excised from Marx. So was the idea that to reject and negate the progressive work of capitalism, technology, bourgeois civilization, the creation of the working class, is sectarian and backward-looking. Marxists reverted to the spirit of those who in the mid-19th century wanted to go backwards from industrialism, and of those against whom Lenin polemicized for their, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, desire to unscramble imperialist concentrations of industry back to an earlier stage of capitalism. The Neo-Trotskyist idea that the Stalinist states were, quote, in transition to socialism, end quote, following in the tracks of Stalin's, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, turned elementary Marxism on its head. The, quote, movement, end quote, was from the periphery to the center. This was the politics of Marx's anarchist populist opponent, Mikhail Bakunin, not of Marx himself, or Lenin or Trotsky. Yeah, I would say that that's like the one thing that like fucking like third worldists and people take from Bakunin is like this belief in like the outsider or something like, or like the belief in like the periphery challenging the center or something like that. Also things like, I don't know, like the lumpen proletariat being a revolutionary force or whatever is something that they kind of one-sidedly take from Bakunin. This was the politics of Marx's anarchist populist opponent, Mikhail Bakunin, not of Marx himself or Lenin or Trotsky. Even reactionary alternatives to capitalism, and not Stalinist ones alone, were seen as progressive, even though they destroyed the fruits of world civilization since the Renaissance. I don't know why I said it like that. It felt right at the time, though. I usually say Renaissance. World history was seen teleologically as a process with an outcome. World socialism, mechanically fixed and advanced, irrespective of what living women and men did or failed to do. 2. The patently false notion that capitalism had reached its historic end was used in the spirit of utopian socialists who felt they had discovered, quote, the last word, end quote. That Stalinism was replacing capitalism was supposedly proof of this proposition. Acceptance of the mid-19th century idea of socialist colony building, which would compete with advanced capitalism and replace it, was at the heart of post-1951 Third World Congress Neo-Trotskyiism. Acceptance of Stalinism as representing a viable, quote, transition to socialism, end quote, albeit one that would eventually need drastic working class reform or even, quote, political revolution, end quote, to perfect it. Three, the idea that the proletarian revolution is made by the proletariat and cannot be made for them had been displaced by the idea of a locum acting to create, if not socialism, then the first decisive step towards socialism, the creation of a, quote, workers' state, end quote. Working class rule was seen to inhere in the forms of bureaucratically nationalized property, a totalitarian economism, a fetish of nationalized economy, separated off from all social and political conditions that might give it a working class socialist character, was substituted for the traditional politics of Marxism. Actual working class political rule, quote, to win the battle for democracy and make the workers the ruling class, end quote, as the Communist Manifesto put it, was pushed to the margins and relegated to the future by the ongoing, quote, revolutionary process, end quote, that was spreading worker, enslaving, and labor movement destroying, quote, worker states, end quote, across the globe. That, quote, process, end quote, was the first and immediate stage of the socialist revolution. Workers' rule would be a second and subsequent stage. The old communist centrality of democracy, even during the dictatorship of the proletariat, went. Democracy was a desirable extra. It could be done without in the, quote, workers' revolution, end quote, at least in the first and immediate stage. The idea of socialist revolution was detached from Marx's notion of the organized, self-aware working class as the force that could make it, and reduced to millenarianism, the hope for a superhuman agent of liberation. Marxists became millenarians, scanning the horizon for the revolutionary agency. Again, Stalinism was central. It was the prototype of the non-proletarian force which nonetheless, through a perverse twist of history, becomes the agent of proletarian progress. 4. Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto saw the development of the organized, conscious communist political party as integrally interlinked with the self-development of the whole working class. The communists would, quote, represent the future of the movement in the movement of the present, end quote. This was replaced by the notion of a, quote, party, end quote, self-defined by the possession of an esoteric doctrine and revelation. The Marxists were those who could see the hidden and secret process leading to a socialist future within the horrors of Stalinism. Having once discovered that truth, their job was primarily to gain enough forces, anyhow, to present themselves as, quote, the leadership, end quote, to the elemental working class revolt guaranteed by the decay of capitalism. Neo-Trotskyiism, rationalizing from Stalinist reality and building its, quote, revolutionary perspective around, end quote, around Stalinist reality, regressed back behind the political level attained in 1848 at the dawn of Marxism. The end.